All right, so we are going to be talking about defining neurodivergence. Right under the cute little boy's face, I'd like to bring your attention to the Face It logo. Tonight's training is sponsored by Face It, which is a movement to end child abuse. And just for those who might not know that much about the Face It movement, it is sponsored by Kosair for Kids. We have lots of different Face It groups that meet throughout the state of Kentucky. This particular training is sponsored by a breakoff group of Face It that works on supporting children with special needs and trying to alert awareness to the fact that our special needs kiddos are much more at risk of abuse and that we want to be able to prevent that situation from happening as much as possible. So, discussion in the chat. We're going to start off. Give me some things in the chat. What are media stereotypes that you have seen about neurodivergent individuals? What is true and what do you think is inaccurate? I'm sure that a lot of stereotypes start from truth, but then we have exaggeration in there as well. So, what can you tell me about what you see? I have somebody put savants in there. Yes, we see a lot of characters that are neurodivergent that are depicted as brilliant geniuses, um, logical and sensitive, amazing at math skills, socially awkward. That part might not be the stereotype. That might be the accurate part. Hyper focused, artistic. Who are some of the media characters that you have seen that you think are neurodivergent? I'll give you a hint. There's a picture of one on the screen. Sheldon, yes. Sheldon is one, obviously. Are there other media characters that you have seen? Monk, the good doctor, yes. Rain Man. So the media has picked up on the fact that neurodivergence is obviously a difference, and that there is a set of characteristics that we often associate with that. And sometimes they exaggerate those characteristics. For some reason, it seems like every time I watch a television show that depicts a child who's neurodivergent, they're really interested in trains. Trains seem to be the thing that like a lot of these characters focus on. But we kind of start off with a baseline of what we think, and then a lot of our perception moves from there. A lot of the world that is not teachers, that is not a parent of a child who's neurodivergent or has a family member who's neurodivergent, only sees these media depictions. And then when they encounter an individual who is neurodivergent, they really struggle to understand what's going on. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those things this evening. Let's start with just some basic definitions, though. Neurodivergence, it's a non-medical term, but it basically means an individual whose brain works a little bit differently. And what I like to think of is computers. Okay, so if we're relating the brain to a computer, let's think about a personal computer, a PC versus a MacBook. Both are excellent ways to do your work, to be able to use a computer system, but the operating systems do not work the same. And so they don't always communicate with each other very well. You can write a file on a PC, send it to a Mac and open it up and things just seem jumbled, even though all the correct information is there. When we're dealing with typically developing individuals and those that we would categorize neurodivergent, the operating systems just don't match. And as in typical individuals, a lot of times we assume that something is wrong with the person that is different than us. And a lot of those assumptions have hurt people over time. And so one of the things I challenge you tonight as we talk through some of this is to start viewing people who are neurodivergent as different, functioning well, but not people that need to be fixed. Now, sometimes a neurodivergent individual has a symptom or a characteristic that does need support. A child who is nonverbal has got to have a way to communicate. And so we have to work with that child to get their ideas across. But they still have lots to offer. And we want to look at a strengths-based approach, which the media often does not give us. When we see news stories of children with autism or other neurodivergent conditions that have been abused or have been violent, we don't see those strengths. We only see the negative things that are associated with the condition. And so that's something that I challenge you tonight to kind of step out of the box and think a little bit differently about. So there, I guess most of the time we really associate neurodivergence with autism and ADHD. And those are the two primary diagnoses that most people consider when they think of neurodivergence. But there's actually quite a few more that we don't talk about. And I went and I looked at the American Medical Association, the Center for Disease Control, American Pediatrics Association, and everybody's list is just slightly different. There may be something on one list that's not quite on another, but for the most part, these are the conditions that were listed on everybody. And there's two slides of them, so it's not just this, but we see the most. Autism is the largest diagnosis that pretty much everybody agrees is under the neurodivergent umbrella. And then ADHD. ADHD, of course, stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Now, there are two types of ADHD. One has hyperactive behavior and one does not, but we call all of them ADHD, and then we just say whether or not the hyperactivity is included. That is just how the diagnostic manual refers to that now. Tourette syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder, epilepsy, Prader-Willi syndrome. These are all, we're going to go more in depth, but kind of sit back and think for the illnesses or the conditions that you do know, what makes them unique, where the brain would operate differently. Other neurodivergent conditions that are listed on multiple medical websites include social anxiety, Erlin syndrome, and then these are four learning disabilities that we see a lot of diagnosis starting in elementary school. Most of you are probably familiar with dyslexia, which has to do with the way that the brain processes reading. But there's also dyscalculia, which has to do with how the brain processes math, dysgraphia, which is how the brain processes writing, and then dyspraxia, which is how the brain processes movement. And though these might not seem as significant as some of the other conditions on the first slide, they have a huge impact on how children learn. And all of the children and adults with these conditions need a fair amount of accommodations. We're going to start with autism and go a little bit more in depth. I'm not going to go too in depth specifically on autism because my guess is you have already heard about autism, particularly in the media in the past couple of months. This has been a hot topic on the news. If you even scroll past news articles on social media, you have heard a lot. And one of the statistics that has been in the news lately is that now 1 out of every 31 children has a diagnosis of autism. So basically, 1 out of every child in an elementary school classroom has probably been diagnosed with autism. More so for boys than girls, 4 times more so with boys than girls. What we have to think about with autism is it is a developmental delay that has to do with social and emotional skills. So it has a lot to do with how the child communicates with others, how they learn, particularly based on emotions. Can they interpret other people's emotions? How do they express their own emotions? And how does that relate to behavior? If I'm very angry, if I'm very sad, and I don't have a way to communicate that and express my needs to somebody else, then often I'm going to find some way to get my point across. And it may go from me not being able to speak those words, maybe because I'm nonverbal, but also maybe because I just don't know what words to say. But if I can't do it that way, then it may escalate to being physical. It may escalate to being aggressive. I may be afraid to communicate with others, and that fear may come out in anger. Um, this is a spectrum disorder, though. And what we have to think about is every case looks different. And I say this every time I talk to a group about autism. If you have met one person with autism, then you have only met one person with autism because no two cases look the same. We used to think of it as linear. So this is on this side were the milder cases, and on this side are the really bad cases. But what we see now is more like a pie chart. And we look at the little pie pieces and say, okay, I have a really hard time with transitions. So that piece of my pie is really full. But I do really well communicating with others and I can make eye contact even if I don't use the words. So that pie piece isn't quite as full. And so there's different pieces that may show up for each child. A child could be very verbal, or a child could have a cognitive delay. They could have motor implications. And so there's lots of different ways that autism will show up. We typically can see a diagnosis by the age of 2, and that shows how much we have begun to realize that this is a problem, that early intervention is needed, is that teachers, parents are beginning to identify warning signs at a very young age. The average age of diagnosis is still 5. But we see 2 and 3-year-olds that are nonverbal, that are not able to make eye contact with their primary caregivers, that have a very hard time with changes in their routine, with changes from person to person. And we can begin to identify the early signs of autism much younger than we used to. So with autism, common characteristics include difficulty communicating and interacting, like I said, restricted interests and repetitive behaviors. Restricted interests is where somebody earlier mentioned like deep interests. A child may get fixated on one topic, like I mentioned, trains. I had a student years ago who loved the Titanic. He was 5 years old, and all he ever did was talk to me about the Titanic and that the captain went down with the ship and how many people were on it and how many lifeboats there were. And he was like a walking encyclopedia. He had very, very deep interest on that one topic and became an expert. Um, Repetitive behaviors, we also call those STEM behaviors, stimulatory behaviors, where somebody does the same thing over and over and over again. Difficulty understanding how others think and feel. And that can lead to being afraid of others or being overwhelmed when others get emotional. Also, there's a lot of overstimulation when it comes to sensory experiences. So some strong smells, loud noises, how textures feel. And that can be textures that I touch things with my hands, or it can be the texture of food I put in my mouth. A lot of kids with autism have a very limited palate because they don't like the texture of certain foods. Um, a lot of these kiddos are very anxious in unfamiliar settings. They really like to know what's going to happen next. And if they try something new, they lose that certainty and then they become very overwhelmed. Or it can be that a child takes longer to process new information because they rely on a set schedule of certain things happening. And when a new experience happens, it really takes them off guard and they have to spend a long time trying to process it. Again, these children can have very high cognitive function, very high vocabulary, or there may be a cognitive disability associated with it. We see children with autism that do have those savant or gifted categories. A lot of times we call those children twice exceptional. They have really high IQs, high vocabulary, and can be considered a gifted child, but at the same time, they have social emotional delays that really prohibit their ability to lead a normal life. If you have questions as we move through, remember to put them in the chat, but hopefully I'm answering questions. ADHD is the other most common diagnosis that we see under the neurodivergent umbrella. And again, in this setting, it often has behavioral implications. And so a child's behavior is very challenging in the classroom. Now, as classroom teachers, who are the more challenging kids to teach? Who are the most challenging kiddos in your class? Are they kids that have a speech delay? Are they kids that have an overall developmental delay? Are they kids that exhibit those challenging behaviors? Anyone? Well, I can tell you from my past experience as a teacher that the children who had strong behaviors are the ones that made it much harder for me when I'm trying to run a classroom and manage a group of 22-year-olds or 24, 4-year-olds. And so autism and ADHD often cause increased stress levels for the teacher because they have so many behavioral side effects associated with the conditions. With ADHD, in some ways, it's almost the opposite of autism, where autistic children like things to be very scheduled, very planned. Our ADHD kiddos can be very impulsive and they don't necessarily pay attention, where our children with autism may be hyper focused and really focus on the same thing for a long time. Our kiddos with ADHD may kind of be bouncing everywhere. Now, I do want to say this, it's not uncommon for a child to have both an autism and an ADHD diagnosis. So then it gets really fuzzy. But if you're working in birth to 5 in early childhood, you should not have a child in your class with an ADHD diagnosis. It should not be diagnosed until elementary school because typically our typical developing preschoolers should be inattentive. They should be somewhat impulsive. They should have a lot of energy. And we don't want to confuse what is normal childhood development with a diagnosis that could have an impact on that child a long way down the road. Most of these kiddos are diagnosed between 5 and 17 years of age. We see a big jolt around first and second grade, which is the typical time that they've been in kindergarten a while. The teacher has suggested there were some behavior challenges, and by first grade, they may get a referral for a diagnosis. And again, this condition is much more prevalent in boys than in girls. So we'll go through some of these others a little bit quicker. You're not going to see as many diagnosed cases, but Tourette syndrome is a neurological condition that causes tics, and that can be involuntary movements, involuntary words or sounds. I think a lot of people have a media perspective of Tourette's as a child who uncontrollably cusses in the classroom, but it could be a lot of movement, jerking. It could be just that the child says one sound over and over again and can't control those movements. And it does emerge around the 5-year-old mark. So you may have pre-kindergarten students who start to show these characteristics. The tics can include blinking, shrugging, snorting. A lot of times they might make silly sounds like barking or hooting, or say rude things. This is less predominant, 1 in 162 kids, and again, more in males than in females. So I'm noticing a trend. I don't know if you are, but a lot of the behavior-based disabilities seem to focus more on the boys. And as many of you know, if you go and observe a preschool or elementary school classroom, you'll see boys often are getting in trouble more than girls are at this age. Also, under our neurodivergence umbrella is obsessive compulsive disorder. This doesn't typically emerge. You can start to see it as young as 3 or 4, but most diagnoses happen in elementary school, if not even older than that. But it has some of the same behaviors as autism as far as the deep interest and the obsession, and compulsive as far as having things exactly the way that they want to. Children that might be fascinated with cleanliness or very specific routines. And this one is more prevalent in females. There are a lot of repetitive behaviors you see with this, just like autism, with stemming behavior and routines. So it is something to keep in mind. This is treated as a mental health condition, whereas others might be treated more educationally based. But many of the conditions we're talking about do have some type of medical treatment or medication. Again, bipolar also falls into this. You're going to see this more if you work in a school age classroom or older, but just to give you an idea, it still falls under this umbrella. And it just because somebody has a manic episode does not mean that they are bipolar. We typically want to see 4 or more within 1 year before we're going to look for that type of diagnosis. But it does have a great impact on concentration, energy level, and activity level. So it has a lot of the same symptoms as ADHD might present with young kids. Here's one that you don't normally think of as neurodivergent, but epilepsy is listed as that. And when we sit and think about it, Somebody with epilepsy is going to have a brain that functions just a little bit different with all the synapses that are connected from the right and left sides of the hemisphere. The brain gets overexcited and kind of misfires often, sending impulses back and forth in the brain. And so the brain is operating differently. There's just too much electricity going on in the brain. And that often causes one of two types of seizures. They can be absence seizures, where you see a child that just kind of stares off into space. They're very quiet. The absence seizures are really hard to find because the child isn't falling down on the floor. They're not doing anything loud. Sometimes they may um, become incontinent, wet their pants, but a lot of times they're just kind of like in a blank stare, and you're like, "Woo, come back!" And you kind of think that they're just having like an ADD moment, but it could possibly be those absence seizures. And then tonic-clonic seizures are the big seizures that you often see on hospital shows in the media where the whole body is jerking and um, and a lot of muscles are working. The whole body has it's like a major workout because every muscle gets sore during that time period. 1 in 26 children in the US are diagnosed with epilepsy, so that easily can be one in every classroom. Um, a child doesn't get diagnosed with epilepsy just from having one seizure. We look for multiple seizures within a 6 month time period before they start treating for it. But most people who have seizures are either diagnosed in early childhood or diagnosed after the age of 60. So it's not unusual to have a child in an early childhood classroom that may have a seizure or may already have an epilepsy diagnosis. Prader-Willi syndrome. This one is so rare, and I can tell you that I've had one child in my class years ago that had Prader-Willi syndrome. It's a genetic condition. It's on the 15th chromosome, but the child or the adult has no idea that they're full, and they're continuously hungry. They try and eat at every moment of the day. And I live with two junior high boys. I understand that children can be really hungry, but this is to the point where the person literally eats themselves to death because they gorge themselves on food no stop, nonstop. It also presents that the caregivers are trying to deprive the child of food because the child constantly is asking for food. They will do anything to get it. You can lock food up, they'll rip doors off. I mean, they are out to eat as much as possible because their body continuously feels hungry. And the parent, the teacher, the caregiver constantly has to say, you may not have anymore. And the child feels like they're being deprived of being able to eat. Typically, if you have a child with Prader-Willi syndrome, they also have a cognitive disability or at least a learning disability that's associated with the disease. We have more and more young kiddos that are diagnosed with social anxiety. Since the onset of the pandemic, we have kids as young as 3 years old that have been diagnosed with anxiety because they have seen so many things in the world that are scary. When I first started teaching, I had never had any type of training on mental health conditions for young children. I got a teacher certificate from birth to 5, and I didn't think that I needed that mental health training. My second year teaching public school preschool, I had 3 children in my classroom that had an IEP for OHI, other health impairment, and it was for mental health, kids that had significant anxiety. And it really forced me to learn about it because these kiddos were afraid of things that kids should never have to worry about. Kids with significant anxiety may worry about, what happens if I'm gone and my house catches on fire? What happens if I'm not with my mom and there's a disaster? But our kiddos with social anxiety are really, really fearful of those social interactions. What it will have, what will happen during the day? Will I be embarrassed? Will people not like me? What do I say? And it's so significant that it impacts every area of their life. They say stressed all the time. And stress it can come forth in a lot of ways. I think for a long time, I thought that kids that had anxiety just seemed nervous or sad. But in the past several years, I've seen kids with anxiety that are extremely aggressive because they go into fight or flight. And if they are scared, they're going to find a way to protect themselves. And that could mean hurting a teacher, hurting a classmate, doing whatever is possible so that I feel safe. We have up close to 5% of the kids worldwide, children worldwide, that have a diagnosis. Now, it's less than 5% when they're young, but by the time they reach adolescence, it's hit that mark. So 1 in 20 kiddos by adolescence is diagnosed with anxiety. Erland syndrome, basically the brain and the eyes are not communicating. So it's a perceptual processing disorder. The brain has the ability to see, and the eyes have the ability to work, but they're not communicating well together. So the way print looks to this person is different than how it looks to the rest of the classroom. The way the environment looks is different. It can create a lot of fatigue, eye stress, headaches. And more kiddos have this than you think. It's also a pretty common secondary condition when you already have autism. So a lot of the conditions under the neurodivergent umbrella are comorbidities or co-occurring conditions. And so if a child has one of them, they're much more likely to have another or even two or three sometimes, because many of these are very complex diagnoses. And then we get to the little school of learning disabilities that I talked to you about. Dyscalculia is a learning disability resulting in difficulty learning math processes, how to manipulate numbers, um, possibly genetic trait. So children who, parents will say, I wasn't good at math, my child isn't either. There's a good argument to that. It seems to be linked genetically. And these kids will often need special education support in the classroom. And it's just because their brain is processing that numeric information, what they see, how it goes through their brain, and what they're able to comprehend back. It's working different than the rest of us. Dysgraphia, again, very similar, but it comes to how we write. These kids often have sloppy looking handwriting, and teachers will get on their case about it. Anybody ever get scolded in elementary school because your penmanship was not very good? These kiddos are often in that boat. But also they have a real hard time with their fine motor skills, controlling a pencil, being able to see what they're writing and then write down. Like if somebody writes on a dry erase board and they have to copy it down, it can be really challenging for them to process that. They can get hand cramps and fatigue in their hands really quickly because the motor manipulation in their hands just isn't what it's supposed to be. And up to 30% of the population can have some type of dysgraphia, whether it's mild or significant. Dyslexia is one that many more people are acquainted with. We know that 10 to 20% of the population has it, and it does affect males and females equally, which is unusual for a lot of our neurodivergent conditions. There is no medication that treats it, but children can learn to read and write well with extra help, reading specialists that work with them. But it basically is just how the brain processes what they read, learning how to spell and how to decode words. The typical stereotype is that people just reverse their letters and write them backwards from what they see in a book or what's written on the dry erase board from the teacher, but really it has a lot more to do with I can see a combination of letters and I don't know how to decode it. And then dyspraxia is the final one of the four learning disabilities, and it really has to do with my brain telling my body how to move. And having coordination issues. A lot of the conditions that we listed have coordination issues because of the way that the brain processes. A diagnosis of epilepsy will often be an individual whose gait, the way they walk, the pattern is just off. You know how when we walk, one arm swings forward and the opposite leg, and we kind of go back and forth. A lot of these individuals, like the same leg and the same arm, move at the same time, so their gait looks kind of funny. These kiddos will often need occupational therapy or physical therapy in order to um, kind of figure out those body positions. They can be cranky or have a hard time getting to sleep because of it. And so we have to think about what kind of accommodations these kids need in the classroom based on the conditions that they have. So before I move into strengths and we start talking about the things that neurodivergent kiddos do better than a lot of typically developing kids, Are there questions that you have about just some of these conditions? I see somebody said that they had dyscalculia. It was rough growing up. As predominant as math and reading are in our classrooms and how that is the main focus, dyslexia and dyscalculia both make it very difficult um, to be successful in the classroom environment without somebody really knowing what's going on and helping them. And a lot of times, those conditions can go undiagnosed for a long time, and kids just struggle through math and reading and make poor grades until somebody finally identifies them. All right, let's talk about the good stuff. All right, we're going to talk about the strengths of kiddos who are neurodivergent. And to me, this is really exciting because they do have traits that we often don't talk about. So some of the strengths that are associated with neurodivergent include better memory. These kids are detail oriented and they will remember small details for a long time. I was talking to a child, he was in like a transitional kindergarten, 5-year-old. He told me the year before what everybody wore in the school picture, what color shirt they had on in the classroom school picture. Like those details just naturally came back to him, and his memory was detail oriented, but also he just retained it. And once he started learning academic skills, he picked them up so quickly. Now, his social interactions were very awkward, but highlighting on his strengths, giving him things where memory was a key activity. He learned how to play instruments really well and could remember melodies really well. And so we see a lot of these different conditions, even things like epilepsy, where we know that the brain is definitely having a hard time processing. There can be strengths with brain activity as well, too. One really cool thing that we see in a lot of neurodivergent kiddos is that they picture things in 3D. So this is why we often see the stereotype of individuals on TV where they are neurodivergent and they have a photographic memory, is because many neurodivergent individuals have pictures in their head of what they remember. They can remember what the page of the book looks like that they read. They can remember where they were standing and what was going on when they found out a piece of information or they had a certain conversation. And so it's very visual, very 3D oriented. And so a lot of these individuals that do have such a great memory are really good at 3D images. You can see how they might be really adept at engineering, architecture, things where you have to figure out how 3D puzzles fit together in order to be successful. Although we talked about dyscalculia and individuals that have a hard time with math, this group is actually really good at math as a whole because of the fact that math is so logical. Many of the individuals that fall under the neurodivergent umbrella have a hard time with anything that is emotional or not factual that can be changed by just different people viewing it, that it's not, it's subjective based on who's reviewing it. Math is right or wrong. And that fits right up the alley of a lot of individuals who have a very strong sense of what fair is, a very logical sense. And a lot of these kiddos are so innovative. These are kids that naturally think outside of the box because their brain doesn't work inside of the box. So when we go to science fairs, when we see kids that are building in the block area, these are the kiddos that are doing things that you haven't ever seen before and creating new things. They're creating new inventions. When you think about Temple Grandin, who's one of our most famous neurodivergent celebrities now, and she works in the field of ag, but she found different ways in order to take care of animals that nobody had ever thought about. And some of it was based on her own experience. As an individual with autism, she really liked deep pressure to calm herself down. And so she thought about, as she's working with cows and different animals, how she could calm those animals down, and used a lot of that technique that was very innovative for the field that she was in, and just adapted and said, we haven't done it that way, but why couldn't we? Um, and again, they just ask deep questions. If you tell most 4-year-olds, that doesn't work, A lot of them will ask you, why not? You can have some kids that'll say, when you say it just doesn't, they're like, okay. You have other kids that will ask you 5,000 questions. Well, why? Well, why didn't you do it this way? Well, why didn't you do it that way? And they begin to push those boundaries and try and figure out, well, if that doesn't work, then would it work this way? And why doesn't this happen? And why is the sky blue? And really push to figure out, well, you said that that's how it always was, but why does it have to be that way? And those are some of the greatest strengths. As a teacher, they can drive you nuts. But there's some of the greatest strength that these kids have as they begin to blossom and eventually enter into their adult life and their careers. Some other things, again, creativity. A lot of our kiddos who are neurodivergent do really well in the arts fields, things like music, visual arts, dance, any type of performance, just because it is naturally out of the box. The same kids are really great at recognizing patterns, even from a young age. You see depictions on TV of kids who are lining up cars or, sorting objects, even at 3 years old, and they're creating patterns from a very young age because they see the pattern, they want to create it again and again and again. Hyper focus. So I was an honor student in high school, and I took all the AP classes that I was supposed to. It really didn't help me that much when I went to college because I learned just the information I wanted to in my field, and I got really good at the stuff in my field. That's kind of what we think about when we think about hyper focus. Our kiddos who are neurodivergent often have a hyper focus and they learn huge amounts of information about one area, whether that's trains, whether it's the Titanic, whether it's the arts. We've seen kids who have autism or other neurodivergent conditions that become masters at the piano because they learn about all the different uh, chord relationships and how the piano sounds. They hyper focus on that, and they might be challenged in other areas. They might not be good at math and reading due to dyscalculia or dyslexia, but they have learned how to hyper focus on this one skill. And as they grow up, they become the expert in that area. Hyper focus can be a positive thing. It's something that motivates them, it's something that makes them confident about themselves, and it can focus them towards their career later in life. A lot of times, parents will kind of freak out and be like, all he does is talk about trains. I'm so sick of hearing my kid talk about trains, or I'm so sick of hearing about the Titanic. Um, but when we start to think about the fact that you have a living expert in your house and they know more about a topic than anything, um, I live with an expert on Taylor Swift. He knows everything about her. If I needed to write a dissertation on Taylor Swift, I know exactly who I would go to. So these kiddos find something that interests them and they do deep dives constantly. Um, my son also is really into European history and he's really into the Tudors. And so sometimes randomly he'll come in and to be like, do you know about Anne Boleyn and what she did and that this happened and this happened? And I'm like, okay, well, I haven't thought about that since I was a junior in high school, but yes, thank you. And it's all stuff that he looked up on his own because he was so interested. These are the kinds of things that we really want to encourage because these kids are learning something on their own and really excited about it. Now, a strength that many children have, but also can sometimes be overwhelming for the parents and caregivers they live with, is their sense of social fairness. These are kiddos that are naturally very logical. It's black or it's white. And so to them, somebody is either right or wrong. You either lied to me or you didn't. I have this problem a lot because I will say something and then make a mistake, or I will say something to my child, assuming that I was right, and then I found out I wasn't. And his reaction is, you lied. Like, no, I didn't lie. I really thought that was the right answer. I made a mistake, or I didn't know that it was going to change. But his perspective is it's right or it's wrong, and there's no in between. Because of that very specific mindset, they are often fairness advocates. This wasn't fair to him. That person didn't get the same as everybody else. That person got his feelings hurt. We have to fix it. This is not fair, and we'll fight for that, which is a huge asset. But maybe at times the rest of us are like, you don't understand. It's not that black or white. But it has a lot to do with logical and analytical thinking. And so our kids excel at that logical and analytical thinking. Again, often math, sciences, things that have very precise um, equations and it has to add up this way. When I mix red and blue, every time it comes up purple. Those are the laws and the way that it works. But then when it's a little off, they have a little bit of a harder time coping with that. Very persistent kids. They are going to come back at you with the same questions over and over and over again until they're satisfied with knowing the amount of knowledge that they want. They're very honest. This is often depicted in TV shows, and I can tell you that I have experienced it very much. When I get ready in the morning, I'll come out, and my son will say, "You look ugly in that," and people will think you are ugly if you wear it. I'm like, "Oh, okay, well, that was a little bit rough. I'm glad that I'm not very emotional today." But it's a very strong sense like that social fairness. It's when it comes to honesty, it's either you're honest or you're not. If we tell little white lies, a lot of our neurodivergent kiddos don't understand the ability to lie in order to spare somebody's feelings. Now, as a parent, I love the fact that my child is honest when I need to go to him and ask, "Did this happen? Are you okay? What are you worried about?" Because at the same time, he's not typically going to lie to me about that either. That honesty is going to be across the board. Um, a lot of these kids are also very tech savvy. They like interacting with technology rather than people because they know what to expect when they enter data into a computer. Whereas when you have a conversation with a friend, you don't know if they're in a good mood, a bad mood, those kinds of things. Computers give them a very strong sense of when I do this, this is the output. I feel safe here. They know what to expect on the sensory information. It's a very logical process. Coding is a very scientific, logical process, and so they really excel there. Um, Along with relating to technology better than people, a lot of the same kiddos relate to animals better than people too. They like having a loyal dog that loves to see them every time they come home and snuggle with, whereas, us people are moody. If we come home after a bad day, we can snap at somebody. Um, and these kiddos are very loyal. When they have established a friend, that friend is part of their routine. They're a part of life. Um, Now they're going to go through the same middle school and high school puberty, fighting, those kinds of things that everybody would. But that sense of loyalty, even through adolescence and catfighting and things like that, is going to remain pretty consistent. So when you have a friend who is neurodivergent, most of the time you have that friend for an extended period of time. They become part of life every day. How many of you saw something in this list of strengths that is different than what you had perceived? You want to chat? Somebody want to unmute and tell me what's something that maybe surprised you a little bit? Somebody's son was obsessed with weed eaters. I like that. For those of you on here who said you have a child at home who is neurodivergent, do these types of strengths, is it what you see in your own kiddos? Yes, persistence doesn't always seem like a strength. Um, it is something that is fabulous for that child over time. And it can also be very frustrating to a parent or teacher at time when you can't just say, "We're done with this for a while, please walk away." Um, but it is definitely one of our strengths not to give up because our kiddos that don't focus at all and don't have those deep interests and don't continually stick with those subjects, they have a harder time learning over time compared to our kiddos that really become an expert in those subjects areas and have persistent friendships. So um, my son is so detail oriented. Yeah, I will tell you that a lot of our kids with autism are very detail oriented. Now, some of our kiddos with ADHD have no detail whatsoever. But again, we have a lot of kids that have a joint diagnosis of autism and ADHD. A lot of times they call it ADHD, like capital A, lowercase u, capital D, HD. And you'll see kids that pick certain characteristics of each one when they have that dual diagnosis. Um, Now, for those of you who mentioned that some of these strengths can also be a challenge at times, we're going to talk about how they do become challenges. And this has a lot to do with two things that I want to mention. First of all, how do we support those challenges in the classroom when we have a large group of kids and we have one child who's having a meltdown because we went to the playground out of order and it messes with his sense of order and he's really emotional? Or as a teacher, sometimes we get focused on the way we think things have to be. Our stress level has increased because of that child. And how do we make sure that we de-escalate so that the child has the best experience? Um, so those are some of the things that we're kind of going to look at moving forward, particularly with complications. So challenges of neurodiversity. Who can tell me what they think some of the challenges are? This is a great time for the chat. Think about the kiddos you've had in class, the kiddos that you're raising or at home. What can be some of the biggest challenges associated with a neurodivergent condition? So somebody put elopement, group interactions, hyperactivity, interacting with others, people just not understanding them. So communication is a definite thread through all this. Managing friendships, reading people's faces. That's one that I always didn't think about, is that I figured that the child may have a hard time understanding their own emotions, but I didn't realize that they were having that hard of a time understanding mine. Particularly as a preschool teacher, I felt like I was always very animated and you could understand what I was putting across, but these are kiddos who don't see that in themselves and they don't see that in others either. Impulse control, um, unable to calm down. And that means that when we get dysregulated, we stay dysregulated for a long time. Um, and then being very rigid with routines. So let's look at the list I compiled and see if it matches your all's. So some of the biggest challenges that we see include stimming, masking, dysregulation, motor delays, communication delays, and then those challenging behaviors that we just don't know the best way to address. So we're going to take each of these a little bit deeper. When I say stimming, what do you think that means? That's a definitely jargon that we use in education. Parents might not understand what that means. Um, just general population might not know what it means. So what do you interpret when I say stimming? Vocalizing, arm flapping, flapping hands, fiddling with things, um, trying to regulate. Yes, thank you. Fidgets. All right, so let's look at how I define it and see if it matches what you say. The basis of stimming is stimulating the nervous system. You're doing something to kind of kick your system into gear. So it often is repetitive actions, movements, or noises. Some of the most common that we see, rocking back and forth, twirling your hair, biting fingernails, or hand flapping. Now, I don't know about you, but I see a lot of typical kids and adults that do these four things on a regular basis. Maybe not so much hand flapping, although I do see people that kind of like me talk with their hands all the time. But the rocking back and forth, even just sitting in a chair, twirling your hair, biting your fingernails. Do we have nail biters on this call? How many of you have ever bitten your nails? Some stim behavior is really common for lots of people, but then there are other STEM behaviors that are a little more um, troublesome. I have a lot of people that are saying, yes, I'm a hair twirler. They're raising their hand saying, me, I do this. Nervous laughing, somebody says, walking in circles, pacers. Yes, pacing would be on. Um, so let's look at some others that might not be quite as common as these more stereotypical things. Chewing or lip smacking. That's going to look like chewing with nothing in your mouth sometimes. Or kids that chew on their clothes, chew on things in the classroom, chew on anything they can put in their mouth, what we call pica, things that are not meant to be chewed on. They may swallow as well. We also see lip smacking where kids will do just over and over again. Spinning and twirling. This is a lot of vestibular proprioceptive information. Kids want to feel their body in space, and so they'll spin around. This is a big one. My son is a ballet dancer. And he used to have different repetitive behaviors when he was really young, but once he started dancing, when he needs to self-regulate, he does ballet turns over and over again, like pirouettes, fouettes, over and over. And so it's become something that's socially acceptable because he is a dancer, but he wants that vestibular proprioceptive sensory information where he feels his body in space again and again. He goes to a school for the performing arts, and they have kids that get up and twirl and dance in class all the time to take movement breaks. And so it's been more socially acceptable for him. But when he was in a typical elementary school, they would call me and they'd be like, Sarah, he's doing this again. He's spinning around in circles. He's doing those no-handed cartwheels on the playground. How do we make him stop? And I was kind of like, do we have to make him stop? If it's calming him down, why is it something that we're fighting? Because if a child needs to regulate that way, why are we stopping? This is where we get into challenging behaviors, where parents and teachers get stressed, is when we can't figure out what is a behavior that we need to stop and what's okay. Um, Staring, finger flicking. Have you ever seen a finger flicker? This isn't that big of a deal. But people develop like pet peeves over a lot of people's STEM behaviors. And so it gets irritating, even though the child isn't actually doing anything that's wrong. Now, where it does become a problem is when somebody is injured, when the child is injuring themselves or they're injuring other people. So head banging is one that we really want to look out for. When a child sits down on the floor, bangs their head on the floor, they bang their head against a wall, which is kind of a common STEM behavior. That's when we have to replace a behavior because we don't want a child to damage the most important part of their body. So children use STEM behavior to express emotions, joy, to regulate their body system. It is not a problem unless it is harmful. So if you have a child who sits in circle time and they flap their hands, that's not the hill that you want to die on. Making that child hold their hands and put their hands in their lap is really not a big deal. And again, we've talked a couple times, and I'm going to continue to mention this. Children who have a disability are 4 times more likely to be at risk for abuse than a typically developing child. And so some of these behaviors put stress on the caregiver, whether that's a teacher or a parent, and they escalate the stress level of the parent higher, and then the parent is more likely to abuse the child, or in some settings, teachers. What we want to do is figure out what are the things that shouldn't be causing me stress and what are the things that are actually worth stressing over. So again, is somebody being hurt? Is the child being hurt? Are they hurting somebody else? I've seen a child whose STEM was pinching, and what they thought it was funny. They walked around and pinched people all the time, but other kids were getting hurt. That's a behavior we had to redirect. We tried to actually teach him to be a finger flicker because he got the same kind of fine motor stimulation, and that's how he calmed down. You see other kids that when they get real excited, they'll hand flap. That's their way of expressing joy when their social skills and communication skills might not be high functioning enough to say, yay, this makes me happy. And so we want to be attuned to how they express themselves and how they use that STEM behavior to show that. But 99% of the time, when you have a child who has a lot of repetitive behavior, they're trying to use that to regulate their body. If their body feels out of whack, they're stressed, they're not able to control emotions, they use STEM behavior to calm down their body so that they don't react in a more negative way. And so STEM behavior should be welcome in the classroom in those senses. And we want to make sure that parents understand too that those STEM behaviors are not bad. That's the child's way of trying to regulate. Any questions on that one? Let's talk about masking. One of the most common things that we hear about children with autism, children with other neurodivergent conditions, is somebody say, well, they don't look neurodivergent to me. Well, what does that mean? Somebody said that to me once about my son. Well, he doesn't look autistic. And I was like, oh, well, we combed his hair on a different side today, so he doesn't look autistic today. What we often see when kids don't show a lot of those behaviors related to their neurodivergent condition is that they're masking. They're covering up the way that they really feel and trying not to be themselves because the way that they relate to the rest of the world isn't socially acceptable. So it's kind of a bummer that we have to talk about masking anyway, because it results from the fact that the classroom or the family is trying to force the child to behave a certain way, and instead of the things that make them happy, instead of the things that make them calm. But there are certain settings where a child, no, sorry, my dog is not enjoying the conversation. Um, there are certain settings where we do want a child to act a certain way in order to prevent injury or stress. Several of you said that children you had in class are at risk of eloping, which means running away. When they get overwhelmed, they go into fight or flight, and they are the flight kids. That's a behavior that is natural for a lot of neurodivergent kids that we want to redirect because we do not want to lose a child. We do not want to put them at risk safety wise. And so that child may struggle during the day to control their anxiety because they know they can't run away and they don't know how to deal with it. Masking often happens when a child is trying to cover up a typical behavior. So it's suppressing their natural traits. That could be suppressing, um, somebody mentions to them that they're weird because they don't look other kids in the eyes when they're talking. So they try and make eye contact and it becomes really awkward. You see kids that are like staring down people because they don't know how to make eye contact in a socially acceptable way. It could be that they're trying to hide their STEM behaviors, even though that's how they calm themselves down. It could be that their parents and teachers have told them that they have to play with other people, even though they need more alone time than others. So they're trying to force themselves awkwardly into social settings and seem like they are okay with being around other kiddos when really it's a great source of stress for them. It makes them tired. If you have a child who is neurodivergent and they are masking all day long, when they come home, they could start sleeping immediately. It is exhausting. Think of somebody you know who is very introverted and they have to be around people all the time. It's so exhausting for them because that introvert does not get charged up around people. It runs their batteries down. And so by the time they get home, their battery is completely run down and they're just like, oh, I have to sleep in order to regroup. That's kind of what masking does to our neurodivergent kids. They have masked their true behaviors all day long. They come home and they're just like, they either fall asleep or they completely melt down for their parents and they scream and have major meltdowns all evening because they have to let that bottled up behavior out somehow. Um, some kids mask on purpose. They know that they can't behave like their true selves, and so they have to focus on, okay, I'm going to look you in the eye when I'm talking to you. I'm going to look you in the eye when I'm talking to you. I don't hear a single thing that you say because I'm going to look you in the eye when I'm talking to you, and that's the only thing I'm focused on. Other kids are unconscious when they're masking. They don't even realize that they're doing it because they've been told so frequently that they have to act a certain way in a certain setting that they start to force themselves to, but they also don't realize how exhausting it is for them, for themselves. Again, the reasons, especially once kids hit elementary school, they know what it's like to fit in. I mean, you all know that when you have 4 and 5 year olds, they're starting to become really social. You start to hear the little girls do the things like, you're not my best friend anymore. You can't come to my birthday party. They're learning all those social interactions and how to behave in group settings. So kids start figuring out, even as young as 4 or 5, that they want to fit in. And if they know they don't fit in, then they may try and force themselves to observe those social norms, even when it's so draining on them. They may be masking so that they don't get bullied. We see this more with school age kiddos, but if I know that my STEM behavior that calms me down is going to get me beat up after school because I'm being called the weird kid, then I'm going to do whatever I can to try and mask that. Or just to not be called names, to not be treated like I'm weird or different because of that. Sometimes you have to mask to function at school or work. If you have adults who are autistic and they maintain a regular working job, then they may have to mask some of their traits throughout the day in order to keep their job. If they're not very social and they don't want to get in trouble for saying rude things to their boss, then they may be masking to avoid those social interactions. We see that with kids too. How many of you have ever been told a really, really hurtful, honest thing by a preschooler? Anybody? Um, some kiddos know that they are way too truthful and they figure it out. So they avoid talking to other people because they know they're going to say something rude. They figured it out at a young age. Um, some kids mask so that they can make friends. Some kids mask because they don't want to get in trouble. So if they're a very, very honest child, and they know they say rude things, then they try and mask so that they don't get sent to timeout or yelled at by a parent. Um, and then others sadly just become ashamed of who they naturally are, and so they try and hide it. And that's where we really want to have a goal of having classrooms that are neurodivergent friendly and focus on these kids' strengths because everybody has a right to come to a safe place every day and a safe classroom where they can be themselves without worrying about trying to hide who they really are. So some of the ways that kids end up masking, a lot of it has to do with sensory stimulation. And some of it is totally our fault as teachers. How many of you have those bright, colorful classrooms that look like 25 rainbows exploded all over them? And you have things like hanging from the ceiling. You've made mobiles of frogs because we studied amphibians and, all that going on. Um, when I first started teaching, my classroom looked like 10 unicorns threw up in it all the time. There were so many colors and so much artwork and things were just happening so much. But I had kids that had really strong reactions to the amount of stimulus that was going on, to the music I was playing, or to all the colors. And after a few years of teaching, I realized that I really needed to tone down what my classroom looked like and think about cool, calming colors instead of having everything bright red, yellow, and orange. I shifted to those cool blues and greens and natural furniture whenever things got replaced. I wanted things that didn't have so much color. I needed to refrain from how much music I played during free time because that was just additional stimuli in the room. We needed to have activities that were quiet as well as loud because the kiddos that are overwhelmed easily, the colors and the noise and everything can be a lot. And if the teacher is not aware of it, then the child is naturally masking to try and deal with it. Or they might just elope and run out of the room. They wouldn't be masking anymore. Um, again, like I said, masking is often reducing or hiding STEM behaviors. Um, or one thing that we see a lot is kids that don't do a lot of facial expressions naturally, like they kind of have a loose face. They might try and copy the social reactions of other kids because they know that it's odd that they're not reacting. So you've got that kid in the class that's like, "Yes, Miss Sarah, I'm so excited." And then you have a kid who might have a very calm demeanor naturally, but they start to copy the other child because they think that's how they're supposed to react. So now you have like that person's shadow, their mirror image. That's a form of masking. Um, Another really typical form of masking is kids that force themselves to make eye contact. And I've seen teachers do this to kids, like say, "You have to look me in the eye. I want you to look me in the eye when you're talking to me." But I can't stress enough how this really defeats the point a lot of times. Because if you take a child who is used to not making eye contact, they look at the floor when you talk to them, they're blocking out all the other sensory stimulation so that they can hear what you're saying and process it. If you force them to look you in the eyes, then again, the whole time that they're talking to you, what they're doing is thinking, "I'm looking you in the eye, I'm looking you in the eye," just like you said, "I'm looking you in the eye." And when you're done speaking, they're like, "I have no idea what you said," because it was taking everything I had to look you in the eye. Um, and then other kids, those kids with deep interests, the little boy who is obsessed with the Titanic, his masking might be not talking about the Titanic because he knows that kids are getting frustrated with him, even though that's the most fascinating thing in the whole wide world to him. And so sometimes as teachers, one of the things that we have to do is to keep listening to those stories about Taylor Swift music and choo-choo trains and all the things that Maybe we're done learning about ourselves, but the kids desperately want to tell you about. A really good example of that is dinosaurs. How many of you have had at least one paleontology expert in your classroom every year that you've been a teacher? And you're like, I am done hearing about the Brachiosaurus. I don't want to hear about another raptor. But those kiddos want to tell you about it so badly. We just got to keep listening because they want to be able to share their stories, and we don't want them to have to downplay the things that they love. I'll do this. Every year there's a dinosaur expert, somebody says. Any questions on masking? As we go through this, I'm going to as we talk about challenges, I'm going to kind of talk to you about how we adapt the classroom, like kids who are trying to deal with overstimulation. We have to think about how we tone down our classroom so it's not an overstimulatory environment. So just think about that. And if you have a question, I don't address like how we might be able to help in the classroom with that, then that's a great question to add to the chat. Dysregulation. Okay, so this is what we hear from kindergarten teachers more than anything. The change from now, like right now with kiddos from 20, 30 years ago. Kids used to come to kindergarten and they didn't know how to read because we didn't teach them how to read in preschool. That wasn't our job. We taught them social emotional skills. We taught them how to play with their peers and share and those types of things. But as preschool got a little more focused on academics, because now everything has to do with reading skills and all that jazz, then kindergarten teachers started telling us that kiddos were coming to kindergarten and they could read, but they were completely dysregulated. Their bodies were just like all over the place and they didn't know how to control themselves, their emotions. They were falling on the floor having meltdowns, and the kindergarten teachers were like, where are my kids that know how to walk down the hallway in a line? I can teach them how to read. I went to school and got a degree for that. But these kids, like they can read, but they can't be in a classroom with everybody else. They're just going berserk. Um, and dysregulation has become a growing problem, even for our typically developing kids. So when we think about our neurodivergent kids, this is a big issue. So what is dysregulation? The best way to say it is that I'm not in control of my body and my emotions. But what does that? What are the reasons that I'm not in control of my body or my emotions? Well, a lot of times there's just so many different reasons that a kid could be dysregulated. One can be physical pain. If I'm growing and my body hurts, then I can be all over the place. If I've got constant stomach aches, then I can be all over the place and just reacting like I'm not in control of anything. Some kiddos may be on medication that causes them to be dysregulated. If you have a kiddo in your class who has asthma and takes an inhaler, asthma medication can totally make a child dysregulated. They can be hyper, they can be not in control of their body. Well, do they need to stay on the inhaler? Absolutely, because a child needing to breathe is obviously our top priority. But the side effect of the medication can have a huge impact on how that child behaves in the classroom, and they need to figure out how to control their body. Big one is emotional distress. We have kiddos in our preschool classrooms and our school age classrooms that have experienced trauma. Kentucky has one of the highest number of kids in the US that are in out of home care, which could be foster care, but it could be kinship care, it could be fictive kin. They just aren't living in a home with their biological parents. And so there's a lot of trauma associated with that. And it could be emotional distress. Could be kids that live with their biological family, but they're experiencing homelessness, they're experiencing poverty, they don't have enough food to eat. And because all of these basic needs aren't being met, there's a huge amount of emotional distress that comes with that. And I can tell you, in all my years of teaching, I have never been able to teach a thing to a child who came to school and the only thing they could think about is I need to sleep or I need to eat. And so that emotional stress is a huge portion of dysregulation. We also think about sensory needs not being met. These are kids who are desperate for more sensory information. So these may be kids who all they want to do is finger paint and play in the sandbox in the water. table, and they're constantly touching everybody and trying to get more sensory input. Or it could be kids that are really defensive. They do not want anybody to touch them. They do not want to be hugged. They would never finger paint because that is the grossest feeling in the whole wide world. They don't want to eat food that is new to them because it might not taste right in my mouth and I don't like the way it feels. I won't wear that shirt because it has an itchy tag. And when I wear it, the only thing I can think about is the itchy tag. So these kids are constantly overstimulated. The lighting, if you have a light bulb that's getting ready to go out and that starts to flicker, that could totally push some of these kiddos over the edge that are really sensitive. Um, and then there's just kids that stay uncomfortable all day, just discomfort. I'm too close to somebody and I'm thinking about, I need to move over. I don't want them close to me. Their clothes, they may need those super soft t-shirts instead of the ones that feel slightly scratchy. Um, things, things like that. But if I'm thinking about my tag and my scratchy shirt all day long, again, that's the only thing that I'm going to think about. Um, for adults, how many of you have ever had a toothache? Anybody? You've had to get a crown, had a bad cavity that hurt. Tooth pain is one of those things that you cannot think about anything else until you get that tooth pain resolved. And it's only in a very small part of your body, but it totally takes over everything that you're thinking about. I have bad teeth. Once I hit 40, it was like they just went downhill. And so for me, like I will end up having pain from one molar and I go to work and I can think about nothing about but my tooth pain. This is how these kiddos feel because the socks have a seam in them. And that seam at the tip of their socks has got them so overwhelmed that they will not think about anything else all day long, except for the fact that I don't want the sock on. I don't want the sock on. I don't want the sock on. And so we have to kind of be aware and observe what kids are being overstimulated by, and then sometimes guide parents to make some of those recommendations. You can get socks without seams now. It's one of the most wonderful things in the whole wide world. You can get t-shirts that are tagless. They are amazing. You can cut tags out. That is also amazing. Find ways to kind of watch and see how kids respond to the environment and then try and figure out what we can do to adapt to that. Um, a lot of kids are overstimulated by lighting in a classroom. The big long light bulbs that are in almost like every classroom in America, they have an oscillation that often causes seizures. And so for kids with epilepsy, that's a real problem. But also kids that are just sensory stimulated a lot, they can see the light bulb, like as the light kind of moves, they can watch the change in the lighting as it oscillates, and it can distract them from everything else. And so we have a lot of special ed classrooms that will turn off their overhead lights and just get lamps and use natural lighting so that kids aren't overwhelmed by too much sensory stimulation. There are even now these really cool lighting covers that are non-flammable. Don't ever use one that could catch on fire. Don't put paper over the lights or anything. But you can get non-flammable light covers and put them over them like in a light blue shade or light green shade. And it kind of dims the lighting in the classroom so that a child who is overly sensitive to that stimuli is not like flipped out all the time. Um, so those kinds of things are very important to think about and how your classroom looks. I know that a classroom is like a personal reflection of who we are as teachers. Once you get your own classroom, you're like, how am I going to decorate it? How many colors am I going to put up? Am I going to decorate it with panda bears or am I going to decorate it like fun at the circus? Um, but what we do when we think about decorating it for ourselves is often overwhelm our kids. And so as teachers, we kind of have to think about how we tone it all down, make it a lot more natural and make it a lot less stimulating. And then we have kiddos that are not so overwhelmed in our classroom settings. When I would consult in classrooms and people would call and ask me to come out like, hey, we have these behavior problems going on. We need you to come and just observe and watch and see what's going on. Almost every time I went out, the first thing I noticed when I go into those classrooms is that the classroom is just overwhelming. Things are stacked up to the ceiling, like on the top of the cubbies. There's, tons of music playing. Kids are like shaking maracas while everything's going on. There's just so much going on. And the first thing that I say almost on every consultation I've ever been to is, whoa, we got to turn down the sensory stimulation. So these last two on my list here, executive function is overwhelmed or anxiety. These are kids whose brains never stop. So they are dysregulated a lot of times because they think so much. A lot of times these are kids with high IQs. Kids who have significant anxiety, a lot of times are smart kiddos who can think of the worst case scenario all the time. These are kids who think like, what if mom and dad don't do this? What if they don't come home? What if the house burns down? What if World War III breaks out? And so they continuously have their mind on overdrive. And because of all that stimulation, because of all that worry, it makes them completely dysregulated. And so those things are harder to see sometimes. These might be kiddos who are staring off into space. Sometimes you might be lucky enough or blessed enough that they confide in you and they'll tell you what they're stressing over. But a lot of times you really have to get to know the child and ask some questions. So I'm going to go back a little bit now. We've got some questions in the chat, I think. So Rhonda has asked, what can we do to help these children who are overstimulated in the classroom? Lights, for example, was one thing. Group care is always a challenge, and I've told many families of kiddos with special needs, not every child with a significant disability is meant to be in a group care setting. Sometimes they do need a more one-on-one setting. But a lot of kids can be productive in group child care if we think about how we design the classroom. So again, lighting is a big thing. Having a safe place in the room where kids can go to be quiet, making sure you have quiet centers and making sure that those quiet centers are not close to your social centers. So what are the most social centers in your classroom? That's going to be block play and dramatic play. Those are naturally set up for kiddos to come together in a group. You don't want those centers next to a quiet corner. We want quiet corner as far away from dramatic play as possible so that if a child needs to retreat, they can. We also never want to associate a quiet corner with a disciplinary action. So you don't want to say, you can't be around your friends right now, go to the quiet corner. The quiet corner should be a place where kids can choose to go because they need some private time alone. Somebody mentioned noise blocking headphones. That's a great choice if kids will wear them. Some kids don't like the pressure associated with covering their ears, so they might not want to wear them, but they may feel pretty good about just going to an area of the room that is designated as a quiet corner. And I've seen classrooms that use teepees, that use tents, that use cardboard refrigerator boxes and let the kids decorate it on the outside to use as their quiet corner. But as long as they have a place where they can escape. Sometimes in those quiet corners, you also have a quiet bag that kids can use. Maybe you know that the couple of the kids in your classroom who get very overwhelmed sensory wise are into art. So you might have a drawing pad and some markers and things in there that they can do that calms them down. You might have some fidgets. You might have some sensory bottles where they can watch, the oil in the water mix with the beads and go up and down and they start to calm themselves. But we definitely want to make sure that they have an area that they can go to when they need to be alone because of overstimulus. All right, so Denisha asks what to do when you notice these things and you offer parents a solution or ways to help their kiddos and they are not receptive. Okay, so this one is hard. First of all, I want to remind everybody what type of information you offer to parents when you are concerned about a child. We are not diagnosticians. None of us are able to be a doctor. We don't have medical degrees. We're not child psychologists. So we never, ever, ever diagnose. We may have worked in early childhood for 45 years and I can put a pin on it every single time I think a child has autism, ADHD, whatever. I may be able to say this is the textbook case, but I still never tell a parent that. What we do is we notice. I am noticing that your child gets upset a lot of times when the room is loud. I am noticing that your child often wants to spend time by themselves. I am noticing that your child plays beside people but does not play with other people. I buy myself, when I see a child that has a lot of those things going on, I buy myself a 99-cent notebook or a composition book that they have out at the beginning of the school year. I write down all the things I'm noticing and I put dates with it. Noticed on this day that this happened. Noticed, noticed, noticed. So when I have a parent teacher conference with that family, I can say, I'm noticing this, this, and this. And I think you should talk to the pediatrician about that and ask him what he thinks happens when we notice these things. That I might think is having petit mal seizures. I'm noticing that that child stares off into space a lot. I'm noticing that they often wet their pants and don't realize why. They didn't realize that they had wet their pants. To me, that says petit mal seizure instantly. But I am not a neurologist, so I can't diagnose epilepsy, but I can notice. And then I can tell the parents that I have noticed these things. Some parents are thrilled to hear that kind of information. Oh, I'll take it to the doctor. Some parents aren't thrilled, but they at least are willing to consider it and talk to the doctor about it. Other parents get defensive and are angry because when we tell somebody that their child is not perfect, it is a really hard burden to bear. When we tell them that I think something is wrong, that's a hard burden to bear. And so parents will handle that kind of information the same way that they would grief. Because basically, in these situations, if a child has a disability, parents move through the stages of grief and grieve for the perfect child that they thought they would have. When you are pregnant with a baby, or you are waiting to adopt a baby, you are dreaming about all the things they're going to do. They're going to be a rocket scientist and cure cancer and be an amazing doctor and be parents, and they'll be the first woman to climb Mount Everest backwards. You know, you have all these dreams. And then you have a child who has a disability, and you realize that they won't be doing those things, especially a significant disability. And so a lot of times parents have to go through those stages of grief to grieve for the child that they didn't get. And so denial is a part of that. Anger is a part of that. And it could come your way. Um, but even if they refuse to deal with the information that you have given them, you may be the first person or you may be the third person that shared that information as they move throughout. And eventually, more people have told them that. Then maybe when somebody 2 years later tells them that they've noticed things, maybe they'll be more receptive to hear it. And you were a critical part of that diagnosis, even though you didn't see something at that time. So if the parent is in denial and they won't respond, we adjust in our classroom setting as best as possible and keep sharing with them things that you have noticed and keep that documentation in case they want to see it. But do understand that this is a big thing for parents to process. And so the first time they hear it, or the second time they hear it, or the fifth time they hear it, they still might not be ready to deal with it. And I can tell you that it can sometimes be even harder if the parent was in special ed and had a negative experience because they don't want their children to go through, how many of you, when you grew up, special ed was that weird classroom down the hallway where kids had helmets on and never got to interact with anybody else in the school? If that's kind of what it was for me, but I'm older than a lot of you. If they still have a negative perception of what special ed was like, then they might not want to subject their baby to that. What they don't know is that when an early interventionist, an occupational therapist comes into a preschool classroom, that is the most popular person in the room. Everybody wants to be with the OT. Everybody wants to be the special kid. And so sometimes it may be that that parent has to come in and observe. Sometimes it may be that the parent has to sit with the information for a little while. But we do that part as far as sharing it with them, but also remember to give them some patience. So we're going to talk a little more about dysregulation. So again, poor environment design is part of it. Another thing can be lack of autonomy or independence. A lot of neurodivergent kiddos, like I said, they can be very cognitively intelligent, even though they have a hard time in social settings or in classroom settings that are structured. So we have to find a way to give them some independence, even though they might not have all the independence they want. This means giving kids choices. If they are falling out on the floor because they're upset that you said they have to do this, then this, then this, then maybe we say, okay, you can have this choice or this choice. What would you want? What do you want to do? Give them a little more independence. You have to make sure that the choices are reasonable. You can't assume, well, you could go stand in the corner all day or you can clean up your mess. There are kids that will go stand in the corner all day. So you have to give two reasonable choices. My son is as stubborn as you could get. They called him Mr. I won't do it when he was in preschool. He named his derby horse, I don't want to do it. Like whatever it was, I don't want to do it was the only thing that came out of his mouth. So you really had to trick him into thinking he was in control of the situation. One time he had a sub, and the sub said, well, you will stand right there until you come over here and sit down and eat your lunch. He stood in that spot in the classroom for 3 hours. His teacher came back from her doctor's appointment and was like, why are you standing there? And he's like, I don't want to eat lunch. And she's like, well, go lay down on your nap mat. And he just hopped off and went and laid down. But when the teacher gave him a fake choice or an inappropriate choice, he was like, this is the hill I'm going to die on. I will fight with you until the end of time. Don't put yourself in that situation. Kids can be stubborn, and kids who want independence will find a way to take it. So you always give reasonable choices, things that you're okay with them choosing. Like you can clean up in the block area, or you could go and help clean up in dramatic play. They're going to clean up either way. Or you can clean up now, or you can clean up in 5 minutes, but you still got to clean up. Okay, either choice is good with me. Maybe they need some time alone and you can tell, so you can say, oh, you can clean up now, or you can clean up while everybody else is at circle time. That might be what they want, is to have alone time. And so they're willing to clean up alone. But when cleanup time is nuts in a classroom, I mean, you flash the lights, you tell everybody to clean up. First of all, don't flash the lights if you have a kid with epilepsy in the classroom. But, you flash the lights, you tell everybody it's time to clean up. And it's like the room is a snow globe and you just shook it upside down. So you've got kids who are like, oh, it's too much. You say, you can clean up in a few minutes, or you can clean up while everybody else is sitting at circle time. Which would you rather do? I'll clean up while everybody's at circle time because it's so much calmer. Okay. To me, that is a reasonable choice. And it's not the hill that I'm going to die on that you're going to clean up at the same time as everybody else. So think about what you actually want to fight over. Dysregulation can be caused by giving a child a task that is too hard. If you say, we only eat spaghetti with forks, and this child has some dysgraphia going on, and their dyspraxia going on, and they can't move their fork well, so they might not eat just because the task is too hard. And then they're throwing themselves on the floor because they can't eat their lunch because they know you're going to be upset if you don't give them a fork. So we have to think about how we adapt things. You might even not have any idea that's why they're throwing a fit, but if the task is overwhelming, the child may just melt down. Now, let me ask this. Is there anybody who knows the difference in a meltdown and a tantrum? Because they're two completely different things. And when you work with kiddos who are neurodivergent, you need to know the differences. I see a yes. Can anybody describe to me the difference? You want to unmute and tell me the difference in a tantrum and a meltdown, or would you rather just me explain it? Connie Turner got it right. A tantrum is a choice. Way to go, Connie. So, a tantrum is I'm with my daughter. I don't have a daughter, but I'm with my daughter at Target, and she says, I want a Barbie. And I said, no, you can't have a Barbie. And so she lays down on the floor and screams nonstop. And I finally say, okay, fine, just be quiet. You can have the Barbie. And then she gets up and she's like, okay, that is a tantrum. It is a tool of manipulation. A meltdown is what a neurodivergent child has when they are so overwhelmed that they can't function anymore. They will fall down on the floor because they can't handle the emotions. They don't know what to do with it. You cannot reason with a child having a meltdown. The whole reason they're having the meltdown is because they can't reason. They're so emotional, they're so overwhelmed, they're screaming, they're crying, they can't handle it. So you have to wait until the meltdown is over and then support the child through the meltdown. Tons of people will come up to me when my child is having a meltdown and be like, well, if I had done that when I was little, my mama would have made sure I can't sit down for a week. I'm like, well, first of all, thank you for the information I didn't ask for. I appreciate the fact that your mama disciplined you very hard. However, my child can't handle it right now, and I've got to wait for him to be rational before we can move on. Do not ever punish a child for a meltdown. support them through it, wait until it's done, and understand that you can't reason with them during that time period. Um, but any of these dysregulatory things we're talking about can cause a meltdown. If a task is too hard and they just feel so overwhelmed, they don't know how to break it down into steps, that can cause a meltdown. A lack of independence can cause a meltdown. Too much going on in the environment can cause a meltdown. A lack of appropriate materials. If you don't have materials in the classroom that are appropriate for a child with a disability or a neurodivergent condition, then you need to figure out how you can arrange your room and find materials that are available for multiple levels of development. Not estimating the child's ability. A lot of neurodivergent kids, especially those with very high IQs, do not like to be patronized. If you talk to them like they're two, they will look at you and be like, I'm going to smack you. Don't do that to me again. So if you talk to the child like, would you like to do a puzzle or would you like to read a book? They're like, I would like to hit you with the book. They want to be stimulated. They don't want to be talked down to. So they can be overwhelmed and head into a meltdown because they don't think anybody believes how smart they are or how many abilities they have. And so we have to really take that into consideration. And then one of the main reasons that we see meltdowns across the board for neurodivergent kids is the communication barrier. I'm trying to express to you how I feel. I can't get my point across. It's so overwhelming that I just lose it. And so this is where, especially for nonverbal kids, where we try and find picture cues, alternative communication devices like on iPads, we use picture schedules, um, find ways that that child has the ability to communicate. A lot of times when a child's real emotional and they have a hard time identifying that, I used to use a keychain that had different faces on the keychain, like one of those just C hooks that you can buy at the Office Depot. And I would have a sad face, an angry face, an afraid face, nervous, happy, excited, and just use those cues and say, can you tell me how you feel right now? It's because the communication barrier can be so overwhelming. They really want to tell you what's going on. And sometimes a child can feel trapped inside themselves. Just because you are nonverbal does not mean that you don't have things to say and to share with other people. And so we really want to make sure that if they're nonverbal, have limited vocabulary, or don't know how to use their words socially appropriately, that they can still communicate with us. Other things that can cause dysregulation, again, a lot of those basic needs, hunger, fatigue. Kids that are bored may have a meltdown because they don't know what to do. They're just so bored. We need to engage them in something, and when they can't figure out what to do, they get overwhelmed by boredom. We see kids who are just tapped out and have hit their introvert limit. They cannot be around other people anymore, and they have a meltdown for those reasons. They've been patronized or corrected too much. There are changes going on at home, and this one is hard. So many things can change at home that we don't know about. Grandma's moved in for 3 weeks. Dad was just deployed. Dad leaving, or dad or mom, somebody being deployed in the military can have the same effect on as if a child had a parent who's incarcerated. One way or another, they're gone for an extended period of time, and one of the most important people in my world isn't here. Um, Divorce, although is very common in our society, is overwhelming to a child when the two most important people in the world to that child, they only get to see on alternating days. I don't see mom 3 nights a week, and so now my world just doesn't feel like it functions. Changes to routine. This can be for kids who are neurodivergent. Changes around holidays are huge. Like you take a week off for fall break, the child comes back and they're dysregulated for 2 weeks because you disrupted the schedule. Mom had to travel for work for 3 days. I have to warn my child's teachers before I travel and just be like, look, I'm only going to be gone this amount of time, but it's really hard on him. These are the things that will have to change while I'm gone, and it will be difficult. And those kinds of changes to routine are huge, and can definitely cause those big meltdowns. Motor delays are another issue. We have a lot of kids who are neurodivergent that have a hard time with big motor skills, gross motor, jumping, skipping, hopping, running, balance, as well as fine motor using our intricate muscle skills. And then apraxia is often where the brain and the nervous system just really have a hard time communicating with large muscles, and movement can be really off. So a lot of our kiddos that have a neurodivergent condition may get physical therapy, may get occupational therapy for fine motor skills, and the classroom materials may need to be supplemented to do that. Like if you have a child who really has a hard time with gross motor movements and they can't sit up independently in the classroom, then you may need to get some big mats to help prop a child up, big pillows to help them sit on the floor. It could be just that there's fine motor delays and you need to get out lots of small pieces. You need to get out the old school light bright and have them put those little bulbs in. You need to do Play-Doh and modeling clay because, man, that is the best way to make strong hands. Get out some modeling clay and go to it. Um, and fidgets can help too with that kind of stuff. But those motor delays can make for changes in the classroom as well. And then we think about our communication delay challenges with these kiddos, particularly kids who are non-speaking or have a challenging time with words, knowing which words are right to say. But also we have some things like echolalia, where a child with autism or other neurodivergent conditions may copy the sounds that they hear other people say, kind of like a parrot in the classroom. And so other kids might not understand why they may feel like they're being mocked when the child is really just trying to copy those sounds because they're like, hey, they said it, I should copy too. And then we think about what kinds of devices, like I said, a lot of iPads have programs set up now to help kids where they can select a picture to communicate. And we want to think about how we can support them so that they can communicate as best as possible. One of the best way to help kids who have a hard time communicating is to have consistent schedules and routines in your classroom so they know what to expect and they don't have to ask a lot of questions on what's happening next. Social communication is something a lot of our neurodivergent kids have a hard time with. This can be empathy, but it can also be things like how close I stand to you. If I get up like right next to the person beside me and I'm in their space bubble, they're like, whoa, you need to back up now or I'm going to punch you. But the child who doesn't have those pragmatic social skills might not realize that they need a foot of space for the person next to them. And so they're like, why'd they punch me? I was just being a friend. I'm standing right next to him. Not saying rude things, you know. I was being honest. They didn't seem to like it. They hit me because I told them that they smelled bad. What's up with that? So helping kids to understand that not only is language a learning tool, but it's also a social tool, and that there are some things that we say out loud and other things that we don't because it's hurtful. A lot of kids who are very into honesty because of being neurodivergent think that they're lying when they don't tell their friend every flaw. We need to kind of help them understand what is socially acceptable, and that can take a long time. They can still be learning that when they're adults. At the same time, we don't want to push them to have every neurotypical behavior. It's okay if they look at the floor when they talk. You don't have to force eye contact. You don't have to require a certain number of social exchanges a day. IEPs sometimes might say they'll have this many positive experiences every day. Well, sometimes you have to have days where you're alone, and we don't want to force a child to feel like they're coming out of their skin. Um, and then we don't want to force them just to act neurotypical and have to mask their true selves. So keep those things in mind. So here's the last point I really want to talk about for today, is challenging behaviors. One, I want to remind everybody that behaviors like stimming should not be considered challenging unless safety's involved. Let kids stim. It is okay to let them stim. And then we want to think about the behavior that the child is doing that is challenging and figure out why they're doing it. What happened right before? What happened right after? Did the challenging behavior emerge because something triggered them? Or did they do the challenging behavior to get a reaction from you? And the reaction is what they were looking for. Are they trying to get attention? Did somebody get in their personal space and they don't like to be touched? And so that's why they pushed him across the room. You know, that's what that 99-cent notebook is for. They pushed a child. This happened right before, this happened right after. It happened right before we ate. They're having a hard time at mealtime. And so they get agitated right before meals every day. Really think about what triggers that. Um, with challenging behavior can come stress for adults, stress for teachers, and stress for parents. Although in many abuse cases, the primary abuser is typically a parent or a boyfriend or girlfriend of the parent. It happens in childcare programs sometimes too when we get stressed because having a whole classroom full of kids and then having one or two or five kids with really challenging behaviors can really make you feel overwhelmed. One of the things I want to reiterate more than anything is that our kids with disabilities are often abused so much more than typically developing kids. And when I first started in the field, I was thinking of like nonverbal kids and kids in wheelchairs. And I thought, well, they can't report or they can't get away from their abuser. But really, they aren't the ones that are abused the most. The ones that are abused the most are the kids with the challenging behaviors. And a lot of that is our neurodivergent kids because their behaviors can be so strong that it can overwhelm the people that take care of them. And so a lot of these changes that I've suggested in classrooms can be things that we share with parents as well and can help them adapt their home life, try and help them to be less stressed. Having a parent who's fixated on not having their child's hands flap, that's just them adding stress to themselves. And we want to do everything we can to de-escalate stress because it's stressful being a parent, but being a parent of a child with special needs is incredibly stressful. You are always thinking about, is my child okay? What do I need to do differently? I don't want this to happen to them. How do I support them? I have 5 more doctor bills this week because we've been to this many therapists, those kinds of things. And so we have a parent population that's already stressed, and then their children have really challenging behaviors. The other thing that I want to remind all of our fabulous teachers on here is that you are mandatory reporters in the state of Kentucky. And if you suspect that a child you're working with is being abused by a coworker, by a parent, then it is mandatory that you report. And there are penalties if you don't. Starting penalties are like up to $250 a fine for not reporting. Okay, I could probably pay $250 if I didn't report, but it can also be up to 90 days in jail. I am not doing that. No way, I was not made for that. So think about those consequences, but remember more than anything is that what we want to do is make sure that the child is not exposed to any additional trauma that they don't have to be. We want to train our parents and give them these suggestions that we're learning so that they can have a positive relationship with their child and really work towards um, not being as stressed when they're caring for their child. And we want to support coworkers. If you notice that a coworker is really stressed in a classroom with some challenging behaviors, that's a great time to talk to your director and just say maybe they need a consult. Maybe they need somebody to come in and watch. Maybe somebody from Child Care Aware could come in and give them some critiques on their classroom, or the early childhood mental health specialists that are also free in Kentucky could come and give them some ideas on how to redesign the classroom, how to make things easier for the kids that are in there. Or just a teacher who needs more support might need a teaching buddy, a mentor teacher who has been doing this for a while. Um, with reporting child abuse, please remember that you do not have to make the final decision. You are reporting because you're concerned and you see certain signs that might indicate it, but you do not have to determine that the child is for sure being abused before reporting it. They have people that are investigators that do that full time. I so don't want that job. But they handle that on a regular basis. So we want to make sure that you don't feel a need to be the investigator. You just say, I'm noticing this, this, and this, and I don't want to report it. Please remember that if you're the person who saw the signs, that you are the person who's required to report it. Don't go to your director and say, hey, you need to report this. Because if your director never reports it and you knew about it, you're still liable. So you can say, hey, director, will you please sit down and make a phone call with me and report this because I'm scared? Or you can do it on your own, but you never want to say, I'm leaving it solely to you. One way that we can help de-stress a lot of people is by helping them understand that there are a lot of misconceptions out there and get rid of those misconceptions about neurodivergent kids. Um, a lot of people naturally assume that if they think differently, that they're significantly disabled. That's not true. There are a lot of neurodivergent individuals that think differently that are amazing. And if they have a hard time fitting into classroom settings or work settings sometimes, we can make adaptations for that. We also don't want to ever make somebody think that they are less because they are different. And in a lot of classrooms, that's the feel that you get. That child is less because they are disabled and they need more help and they can't do the same things as everybody else. And then the child feels less confident. We don't want people to believe that every neurodivergent child is a savant, because then they expect too much out of kids who cognitively are at normal developmental level, or maybe they have a cognitive delay. It's so important to stress to everybody that autism is different for every child, that neurodivergence is different for every child, and that even though they're spectrum disorders, we're going to see different things emerge, and we want to be just aware but accepting that those differences are there. Um, Behaviors and differences are not always impairments, like I said. And teaching a neurotypical child to be typical might not be the best way for them to be successful. It's okay for them to have deep interests and for them to have certain STEM behaviors and for them not to have to mask during the day and be themselves. These are not mental illnesses. All neurodivergent conditions are not autism. There are things about neurodivergence that definitely have been stereotyped and are incorrect. And we want to make sure that people understand that. Um, a lot of neurodivergent individuals are verbal. A lot of people with autism are verbal. They just might have a hard time getting their words out. And the progression is not necessarily from best to worse. We don't have high functioning and low functioning autism, which is the words we used to use. Instead, we have somebody with autism that has a hard time with transitions, but is more verbal and has a high IQ, but may have a hard time with motor skills. Everybody on the spectrum has their strengths and their weaknesses. And one of the last things that I want to share is that there are some things that we just don't want to say to families and kiddos who are neurodivergent. Things like, everyone's a little neurodivergent. I have the same thing going on as you. Probably you don't. Probably their life is a lot different, and we need to honor that. You can't just tell somebody that they don't look neurodivergent because there's not a look. You cannot judge that somebody just because of whether or not they make eye contact is neurodivergent. You don't just say that this is a phase you grow out of. Autism and other neurodivergent conditions are a lifetime diagnosis. Again, when you have a neurodivergent child who is melting down and is very afraid, emotionally distraught, you cannot tell them that they're overreacting and focus on that, because they are not rational at the time of the meltdown. And we want to avoid terms like high functioning and low functioning. We really want to work towards acceptance to help these kiddos in the classroom. Again, if you have concerns about child abuse, remember the child protection hotline, and remember that teachers are mandatory reporters. So that is the gist of my content for this evening. I hope that you learned at least one new thing. Thank you for hanging with us. Debbie is going to put the link for the survey into the chat. You have to complete the survey in order to get credit. Please do not get off the computer without doing the SurveyMonkey survey. That is how I will enter your ECE TRIS credit. Give me a little bit of time, but it will go into ECE TRIS. Any other things, follow up? Oh, if you have additional questions, you can track us down at KYA. Again, I'm Sarah Vanover. You can find me on the KYA website if you want to ask questions. We post blogs on the KYA website. We've recently done some, like clearing up the misconceptions on autism after it had been in the media quite a bit, supporting kids in childcare who have special needs. Kind of keep those things in mind if you need some more resources.